In a recent article that I had found here, someone had posted on Reddit. This was actually 3 years ago, and it talks about. It says, "I'm a man, and I don't understand why many women have an OnlyFans. Could somebody explain?" And so basically, OnlyFans is just basically online pornography. The only difference is that you, a person who creates the content, you get to choose how and when. Whereas when you work for, let's say, a company that does pornography, it's just like working for any boss, and of course you become tied to the things that they want, that they're creating for their content, etc. Now what you're going to see is, due to many women being in the workforce and many women being in debt, a lot of these women unfortunately have to turn to some form of prostitution to be able to get by, and this is what many women are doing. And this is what I had said before, that in essence men create the environment and then women flock to the environment, because men nowadays aren't looking to get married, they're not looking to have a family, they're not looking to have children, and so it becomes harder for women who are more likely to be in debt, especially when it comes to student loan debt. And this is an article from CNBC talking about women reported on average almost 70,000 in debt, and most of this debt of course is from student loans. Now, women, of course, aren't making, by comparison, as much as many of the men because of the careers that they pick, etc. And so this article talking from CNBC talking about how, in essence, it's the government's benefit to keep these women single. It says there are more single women working than ever, and that's changing the U.S. economy, as women, of course, are producing something like 7,000 towards the American economy. And of course, the goal is, as says there, by 2030, 45% of working women ages 24 to 44. Right? So this is basically your single women. Most of your women, childbearing women, or say women who are at the age of bearing children, are going to be single, in debt, and they're going to be working. So in essence, what they're doing, because of socialism, right, because of printing all of this money and creating all of these social programs like your Medicaids, your Medicares, pension programs, the too big to fail bailouts that we've seen. This, of course, is what you see under socialism. This is what you see under socialism. Now, of course, the people who own the assets, the people that own the buildings, they own the houses, they own the corporations, this, of course, benefits them. And so they print out all this money. They give it to you. You then, of course, consume their products, and then they once again retain the money, which, of course, they use to keep you indebted. And, of course, what you get is ever increasing prices. And so the article goes on to say that this is actually a statistic that is going to be up from the 2018. Right here it says 2018 single women made up 41% of working women in that age group. And so moving forward, this is why they say, that these women are going to continue. One of the biggest voting bloc are women. Women are going to keep voting for socialism, because if the men aren't willing to take care of them, if the men aren't willing to get married, then it has to be done collectively. And so women would typically vote for socialism. Women are socialists by nature because they are dependent, and they're going to be either dependent on an individual man, or they're going to be dependent on a man collectively. And so in America, we do it collectively. We've in essence outsourced the responsibility of having children, having a wife, and everything that goes along with being in a relationship and the head of the household. Men aren't willing to do that anymore because we really don't need the woman. Back in the days, they would do things like cooking and cleaning, child rearing, and of course providing sex. Nowadays, you can get the sex that you want. You can get a maid to cook and clean and do all those things. So men typically really don't need women. This is why back in the days they used to say things like, don't give away the milk for free, then no one's going to buy the cow. And then, of course, women got offended by that statement. They would say dumb things like, I'm not a cow, not really understanding the premise that many of their mothers and fathers were trying to tell them, was that if you're basically giving your sex away, then why would a man want to marry you? Why would a man want to assume responsibility for you? And of course, women were gaslit, and they were told that no, you're independent, you don't need a man, you're a strong woman, etc. And of course, they pushed these women out into the workforce because it helped lower the value of labor, and 2, it allowed them to tax more people, and then 3, it allowed them to, of course, then print more money. And so these dollars basically spread abroad into different countries. And this is basically how the dollar hegemony is able to stay in place, because they're able to provide this liquidity via consumption. Now, eventually what happens is you end up with poverty. Regardless of how much you're able to consume, the standard of living continues to fall. And this is what we're seeing in the United States, where people just aren't able to own anything. Now, in the beginning, the people who got in at the Ponzi scheme at the beginning, just think of, right, like what happened with FSB, that dude that was selling crypto, what's his name? Bernie Madoff, right? But the people who get into the Ponzi scheme at the beginning are the ones that make the most money. This is why you have boomers like, what's his name, Robert Kiyosaki, who talks about how amazing it is to own real estate. And it's because he got in at the beginning. He got in at the beginning when the Ponzi scheme was new and the government just started printing all of this money. And so he just went out there, understood what was going on, and went out there and bought assets. And so the people who own the assets in a Ponzi scheme in a socialist environment are the ones who benefit the most. And this is where you get, your 1% and your 2%, your 5% people, etc., where they own all these businesses, they create all the stuff when the money is cheap and the cost of labor is cheap. And then of course they vote, right? Boomers are some of the biggest voting bloc. And so they keep voting for the expansion of wealth. They keep voting for the expansion of the currency. And what this does is it devalues the labor of their children who come after them, and their grandchildren who've come after them, and their great-grandchildren who have come after them. And I've talked about this before, and this is what Ronald Reagan warned about. He warned about the dangers of socialism, that in essence, it would create debt slavery for your children, for your grandchildren, and for your great-grandchildren. Well, we're living in the time of what he spoke of, where you have millennials, Gen Z, they're just not able to afford to live in their own countries. They're not able to do the things that adults, typically do, with getting your first apartment, getting a job. They were promised if you go out there and get this degree that you're going to have a stable future. And of course, none of that is happening for the majority of people. Many people are struggling. Overwhelmingly, the people who struggle the most are women. And so this is why you see more and more women. Of course, this man asked this question: why is it so common for many women nowadays to have an OnlyFans? And it's just prostitution. At the end of the day, it's just prostitution. And women who fall into poverty, the only thing that they have left is sex work. And this is what you see in impoverished nations. This is why you see many young American men and European men, they go into places like Colombia or the DR. You see a lot of black men go to the DR from the United States. And what they do is they take their dollar in many of these nations because the dollar is the world reserve currency and America can export their inflation, it causes more inflation in many of these other nations. And so what the government does is they say, well, you say to yourself, well, we're going to do business in our own currency. And then, of course, the American government says, well, no, you can't do that. If you want to buy commodities, you have to buy commodities in the dollar. And this is what keeps many of these nations poor. It's not that their labor is worth less. It's that America is devaluing their labor because it takes dollars that they have to hold on to then go out and buy things like wheat and corn and other commodities, oil, natural gas, etc. And so America can create all of this inflation, and they can consume all of these products, all these commodities that are then made abroad and of course dug up from the ground, they're mined, etc. And this is what socialism is. This is how you have a global socialist system, because globally the people who are dependent on doing trade in the dollar are seeing their labor devalued. Their labor gets devalued. They don't own their labor. America makes them work harder for their labor for our benefit. This is what you get under socialism. So you have multiple tiers of socialism, not just socialism within America, but then socialism globally. And then of course America puts puppets into these different countries, and this is where the communism comes into play, where they own the assets at the top and they drive the people into poverty. This is why you see even though Africa is wealthy, when it comes to commodities, but the people are in abstract poverty because you get different forms of communism in the country, and Africa is a communist nation. Many parts of Africa are communists. And so America sends dollars over there through the United Nations. And this is what keeps the people impoverished. And of course, they do food aid, and food aid, any form of welfare just causes laziness. And of course, the farmers that are in that country and the other businesses that would sell food, they can't compete with free. And so the people fall into poverty. The people become controlled by the government because the African governments own all the assets that they've bought up with the dollars that are given to them from abroad. This is what you saw going on in France, where Niger was revolting against France because France was giving them their cheap currency that they just print out of thin air. And then they were basically stealing gold, they were stealing uranium, and they were stealing other commodities. And the people of Niger are like, we have this French currency, we can't do anything with it. And so even though France is quote unquote paying for it with dollars that they just, someone wrote on a napkin and said, here's 100 million francs, give me all your shit. And of course, this is what causes poverty for the average person. And this is why I routinely say that we live in a socialist society for the people. Everything is socialized. Just think about it, right? When a big corporation is going to go out of debt, they're going to go bankrupt, and then they're too big to fail. So the losses get socialized to the people, but then the gains are, of course, kept at the top. And this is what you get in this sort of a system. This is not a free market society. We haven't had a free market society for the better part of 100 years. And this is the whole purpose of Marxism, socialism, where this is why they make that statement. I forget who it was that made that statement. I believe it was a Rothschild or someone else. I'm forgetting the person's name, where they had said the fact, I care not who makes the laws, as long as I can control the currency. You can make all the laws you want, but if I control your currency, then I control the entire system. And then if I can control the food, well, then I control the people. And so this is basically what communism looks like. Socialism for the people. Everything is socialized. You pull everything up. All the wealth gets pulled up. This isn't what free market capitalism looks like. Free market capitalism, if I want to go out tomorrow and start a business, there isn't anyone that's going to say, let me see your license, let me see your certificate, let me see your degree. That doesn't exist. That does exist in communism, where you have to ask permission because you don't own your labor. You don't own the ability to go into that field. We will let you know if you meet the requirements to get into that field. And then if you start making too much money, we're going to print more money to devalue your labor so that we can buy your labor without actually having to put forth any effort outside of just typing in digits onto a screen. And so this is why you see more women being lured into forms of prostitution. And of course, you had politicians like AOC, right? A young, beautiful woman telling people, seeing women falling into the snare. And then, of course, men and society shaming these women. This is disgusting. But from their standpoint, they're like, well, we need these women to go out there and prostitute themselves because the men aren't going to do it. The men aren't going to go out there and take care of these women because of the system, because of socialism, right? They give you these women and then they encourage these women to divorce you. Why? Because they're trying to steal your labor. They're trying to steal your assets. They're trying to steal your home. They're trying to steal that college fund so that you use that money towards divorce for lawyers and for the court system, right? For child support, etc. This is what you get in socialism. And of course, this is going to continue to go until it collapses. And when it collapses, the level of poverty and wars that will take place during this time period are going to be at a level probably never seen in history. Because when the people at the top realize that they can no longer create the wealth that they want for themselves, think of it, just look at Argentina. Argentina is a perfect example. I believe the inflation rate, the interest rate in Argentina, it's like 130% inflation. And so they've had to raise rates, to like 20 something plus percent. And the people have fallen into poverty. Now, of course, most of those people were working for the government. And so I reported on this. This was an article that came out a long time ago in Zero Hedge. And they had said when the government, in essence, pulled all of the welfare away from the people, they had 60% unemployment, meaning that most of those people, that entire economy, was built off of welfare. And so what happened when the government had to pull the welfare because the inflation was so high and prices were going out of control and they were in essence experiencing hyperinflation? The people, of course, ousted the government and they voted another government, and the inflation continued to go higher until they will completely collapse, and then they'll be enslaved to the European Union. This will be the outcome for many countries. And this is what, in essence, what America is doing when they create this sort of an inflation. This is why America attacked Europe by destroying the pipeline to create inflation, and then they sold natural gas to Europe at 5 times the rate. And this is their ally. This is quote unquote their ally. And so what they're doing is they're picking apart the European Union. They're driving them into poverty, and this is why you see, I follow a couple of different UK YouTubers, and they talk about all these different like dystopian scenarios. We're going to implement cameras, and we're going to carbon tax you and all this stuff, right? We're going to limit your movement, and you're not going to be able to eat meat, etc. This is what you get. This is the poverty that you get via socialism. When it finally collapses, governments will do what they need to do to ensure their survival within the country, and those that they can extend their force over. So America is extending their will over Europe and over the UK. And so you're seeing businesses that are being driven out of the UK and out of Europe coming to America, and America offering them cheap loans. This is what America was doing back in the 70s, where America was printing all of this money and then buying assets in Europe. And this is why France was looking over them and was like, I see what you're doing over there. I want my gold back. Take your currency. And then they went into the country with their military, and said, give us back our gold. And then they dipped. And so this is where the whole purpose of U.S. treasuries and selling debt came from, because they needed to extend the Ponzi scheme of socialism to other countries. And eventually, it always ends the same. Socialism always leads to communism, because when it finally ends, and there aren't enough people to continue the Ponzi scheme, the government will seize the means of production, and the government becomes authoritarian as they continue to try to hold on to power over the people, and the people fall into abstract poverty. And it's happened from country to country, and eventually, with the route that many countries have gone, by following the lead of social Marxism, by introducing centralized banking into their countries, this is what you've gotten. Even though this is what America fought against, supposedly, back in the early 1900s, many of these countries adopted socialistic practices. This is the whole purpose of centralized banking. Centralized banking is the foundation for socialist Marxism style of a system, and it always leads to poverty, and it eventually leads to communism and the collapse of nations. And so this is why you see women who are too expensive for the American man to care for and are too risky because of the risk of losing all their assets through the divorce that is encouraged by the government. This is why you see more women turning to prostitution. And if you think it's bad now, just wait. Many of these other countries that are experiencing very hard times, most of these women are going to fall into poverty and prostitution on a level that you've never seen before. And of course, at that point, then as the next generation grows, those individuals will maybe more likely to marry, because the women won't have the mindset of the socialists that came before them. They'll have the understanding, we need the man. We need the man to provide for us. And so they'll be more accommodating, and they'll be more likely to be more traditional. This is why I've talked about articles that say that the younger generation are more conservative. They're being more conservative. The reason being is because the hard times create strong men, and women are a lagging indicator of men. And so by the time my generation dies off, you may see the return of patriarchy as many of these nations fall into poverty. The hard times that are being created now and through millennials, right? Because many of the men that are my age and a little bit older, these are the men who are partaking in prostitution. When I go overseas, this is what I typically see. Older white men from Europe or from the United States looking at prostitutes in Cartagena, or in Mexico, or in the DR, right? Or Thailand, right? It's always old white men. Why? Because they have dollars. They have dollars that they're able to use. When that goes away, you won't see that anymore. And so you'll see patriarchy return into your own country, and now the men will be more willing to be responsible for the women in their country, and the women will return to being feminine, fit, and friendly. And that's when you'll start to see changes within many of these Western countries once they fall into poverty. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. This video is a lot longer than I expected. Feel free, of course, to leave your comment below and subscribe if this is your first time being here, and I'll check you next time.